Fantastic. And I appreciate that, Kevin. I appreciate the invitation to be able to be here and to be able to meet with everybody. I look forward to the time when we can get down there and try to actually meet face to face at some point. I know that's going to happen. So I'm going to share my screen now. So Kevin, tell me, can you see that?
Yes, sir. Very good.
All right, fantastic. Okay, so, when Kevin contacted me back over the last few months, whenever it was, we started talking about what type of topics to try to cover. What we decided was just, okay, we want to cover the things that you need to be thinking about right now. And, I look up and down the list of the people that are on this Zoom call. And quite honestly, I doubt that I'm going to be teaching you a whole lot as much as maybe I'm going to be reminding you of some things that you need to be paying attention to over the next couple of months. So we're just going to jump into this thing, okay? Here's the first thing. We are dead right at the time that we need to be planting clovers. And so we don't want to get behind on that. And if you look at the various reasons why we want to plant these clovers in there, we get improved quality in our grass pastures and hay fields if we add clovers to them. We can reduce the amount of nitrogen we have to apply. And then depending on the clovers we choose, we can actually lengthen our grazing season. So I thought, let me just show you a little bit of data on this. So here's one thing that I went through and took all of the tall fescue hay samples that had been sent to our forage testing lab there at the Soil Plant and Pest Center. Okay, and this is data from 2019. And I just took the average of all the ones that were identified as tall fescue alone and the ones that were identified as tall fescue with clover. And you can look and see over here that, now this is averaged across the state, but that the grass averaged 10.9, almost 11% protein, whereas the grass clover averaged just a little bit over 12. Okay, and so, you have the chance, if you start adding legumes, to bump your protein level up a little bit. I'm not going to sit here and try to say it's going to be the thing that's going to revolutionize everything. It's not going to take it from being a really, really bad hay to a prime hay, but it can bump that protein a little bit. I also looked at the TDN level, which is the total digestible nutrient, or it's a measure of the energy content. It increased the energy content about 1% to 1.5%. So, I would tell you that the number one thing, if you want to improve your hay quality, is going to be making sure you cut it on time. Try to get it when it's right at that late boot stage, just as you start to see, the seed heads emerge. But adding clovers can add potentially 1% or 2% improvement in the protein as well as that TDN level. So I don't think we want to just toss that away. If for no other reason, we can slightly improve our hay content. If you look at kind of the yield distribution, if we choose the clovers, and particularly if we include red clover in our mix, we can actually kind of lengthen our grazing season. So this is some work that I've shown before, but it's some work that really shows the difference in the yield distribution with fescue by itself, just fertilized with nitrogen, versus using legumes. So what they did was they took fescue, and that green line right there was where they fertilized it with 60 pounds of nitrogen, which is kind of our standard recommendation for straight fescue. But they also grew it with either red clover, white clover, or a mixture of red clover, white clover, and annual espinosa. And it shows kind of where the yields came on this. And what you notice is when they fertilized that fescue with nitrogen, it did what we all expect. The grass greened up, grew really fast. And so you get this big burst of growth early in the spring. But if you follow what happens to the yield the rest of the year, it kind of, doesn't, you don't continue with that same fast growth. It kind of levels off for the rest of that spring into that summertime period. Whereas if you look, when they used legumes as their nitrogen source. Now, they didn't get that big burst of growth, but what happened was they got a little bit more of kind of a steady line growth. and they ended up with the same yield as with fescue fertilized with that 60 pounds of nitrogen. It just didn't come all early in that season. It was spread out over a longer period of time. And so that's another reason why we recommend using legumes, because you're going to see more growth later in that season. So instead of having nitrogen, this big burst of growth, and actually a lot of times it grows faster than what we can graze it at that point, and then it levels off, we can get kind of more of a steady growth during that entire season. And so, you know, you may be using, a lot of times have been using just white clover, but really we would urge you to go ahead and include red clover in that, because that will increase, you know, your growth kind of as we move into that mid to late May, June, maybe early July period, because red clover grows a little bit more during that period. So here's the recommendations that we've got. We really would like to see you plant it the last 2 weeks of February. So we're right in there, you know. Now what we recommend is 2 pounds of white clover and 4 pounds of red clover per acre. Mix those together. And if you do them these last 2 weeks of February, you can just broadcast that across the ground. The fescue's not growing yet. You know, so it's these clovers are going to have a chance to be able to get established and to begin to grow before the fescue begins to be a real competitive problem. And so it's going to be something that you need to be thinking about doing here over the next, you know, week or so, something along those lines. Now, Dr. Rose is going to cover weed control tomorrow, and I'm sure, you know, that he's going to be covering some stuff on, you know, buttercup control, you know, thistles, plantains, various things like that. And so you're going to have to try to figure out, you're not going to be able to plant clovers and spray to control weeds in the same spring. So you're going to have to make a decision which way you're going to go with it. Which, you know, do you have enough weeds that you need to go ahead and spray? Well, then do that. We can worry about clovers next year. But but if you don't have too much of a weed problem so that you're not going to need to spray this spring, then you need to follow this recommendation about clovers. Okay.
Hey, Gary, there's a question in chat. Do you want to get those at the end? This one has to do with clovers. Do you want to take
it? Well, then let's get it right now. What is it?
Well, the question is, how do we spread clover with a Baltic seed spreader?
With a what seed spreader?
A Baltic, B-A-L-T-I-C.
What is a Baltic? Is that like a big PTO driven whirlybird?
Basically, yes.
Okay. Well, you better bulk it up with some pelletized lime or something like that, so that you have more bulk to actually be able to spread. So instead of having to just spread, you know, 6 pounds to the acre, you might go ahead and add another 5 or 6 pounds so that you can get it, you know, calibrated down. That's about the only way you're going to be able to do it with one of those. Really, a really good investment is going to be some of these little small, you know, spreaders that you can hook on a ATV or the tailgate of a truck or something that run off of a battery, something like a little herd seeder. But there's a lot of different brands of those things. But those things are made to be able to seed small quantities. And usually if we have to seed any clovers, that's what we try to do, is use one of those little small electronic seeders. Any other questions on that? Any other questions about clovers before we go on?
That's all in the chat.
Okay. So the next thing we want to go on is, again, this is just going to be a reminder. If you have not soil tested yet, you need to go ahead and try to do it, because, you know, soil testing, knowing what your pH is and your phosphate and potash levels are going to influence how well your clovers do. And I just pulled out some, well, hold on, I stopped my share. Let me go back again and do this again. Okay. So I pulled out some information. If you just look, you know, like at tall fescue, if it's something that's going to be yielding about 3.5 tons, this is an estimate of the pounds of nitrogen, phosphate, and potash that get removed if you're getting that hay yield. Okay, now I know down through y'all's area, you know, you really don't have to worry about phosphate, but we don't want to fall into the trap of thinking, well, just because we got plenty of phosphate down through y'all's area that we don't need potash, because we can become limiting in potash, you know, relatively quickly if we're trying, particularly if we're producing hay, or if we're grazing in such a way so that, you know, the animals are grazing all over the pasture, but they're dropping all their manure around a water or under a tree line or something like that. So you want to make sure that you're going ahead and soil testing, seeing what your pH is, as well as what that potash level is, to see if you need to do anything about that, because making sure that you have the correct potash level, you don't want too little because it's going to limit plant growth and all. You don't want too much because it can impact magnesium level in the plant. And we'll talk about that with grass tetany here in just a second. But go ahead and soil test. I know that y'all are getting those 70 degrees. That ground's going to thaw out and that ground's going to be soft enough that you can get a sample. Okay, so go ahead and do that now, get it in, and you can get your results back to know how to fertilize. Okay, here's going to be the big one, man, y'all are going to face here over the next couple of weeks. Okay, is repairing hay feeding areas, because we know what follows snow and ice, right? It's mud. Okay, and so y'all are going to be up to y'all's eyebrows in mud here in just a few weeks. And so we're going to have to figure out how to repair some of these areas where you've been feeding hay. And I'm going to give you a couple of different options. Okay. The first one is that, if you're going to be able to stop feeding hay or put animals into another area different from where you've been feeding hay, then what you can do there is come in sometime the first couple of weeks of March, smooth that ground up with a harrow or a disc or something. And you can either broadcast annual ryegrass or oats to try to go ahead and get some ground cover. And also you can get some spring grazing off of that. If it'll dry up enough, you'll be able to graze that. Now, Dr. Renata Nave there at the Middle Tennessee Research and Education Center actually did kind of a little bit of a study along these lines a few years ago. And if you made me choose between these two species, probably oats will give you a little bit faster growth and a little bit more yield. So if you had to choose, I would go with oats, but there's not such a major difference between these two that it makes me say definitely use oats. But you can go ahead and use that for the springtime. And then when you get into the mid to late May, maybe the early June period, these cool season annuals are going to play out, and then you're going to be left with nothing on there. So what you should probably think about doing is broadcasting some crabgrass, just kind of smooth the ground, pull a hair or something, just kind of loosen the ground up just a little bit. Broadcast crabgrass at 4 to 6 pounds to the acre. What that's going to do then is that's going to let you be able to have some grazing on that area. If you look at our studies, when we plant in that kind of May period, usually in 30 to 45 days, we're able to graze the stuff. So you can get some grazing during that summertime. And then when you get into the, September period, at some point, you're going to need to think about, replanting tall fescue. So you'd come in September, graze it off pretty hard, and then plant fescue. And again, we recommend 20 pounds to the acre. Excuse me. So this option right here is if you can plant that annual, in that March period. If you can't get it planted by about the second week or so of March, then probably it doesn't benefit you to plant the annual. You probably should just wait into May and plant the crabgrass. Now, if that's what you're going to try to do, if you can't plant the cool season annual, just wait until May, smooth the ground again, just to get everything kind of leveled out. It'll cause a little bit of soil disturbance, and then just broadcast the crabgrass. And then the same situation comes in that, you're going to need to think about trying to plant tall fescue in the fall to get that tall fescue staying back. And then you'll be good to go. If you notice, we haven't mentioned about coming in February or March and planting tall fescue into these areas. That's not going to be something that's going to be successful for you. You might get that fescue up and get it to growing, but then you're going to get into that summertime and the weeds are going to just eat its lunch. So you'll be better off, trying to use either the oats or annual ryegrass followed by the crabgrass, and then wait and plant your fescue in that fall period. Okay. A couple of things that you need to think about, okay, is that even if you follow this type of program, you're still going to have a weed issue. And we all know spiny pigweed is, going to be very prevalent in these areas. So we might, by getting these covers on there, we might kind of reduce the pigweed problem, but we're not going to eliminate it. So you might need to be thinking about, trying to spray with some 2,4-D, probably at least once, potentially maybe even twice, to try to keep those weeds down, because what's going to happen is every time you get a rain, it seems like you might even get a whole new crop of germination on those things. The other thing that you have to think about is that if you don't do something to change your hay feeding strategy, then there's really probably no reason to think about trying to plant fescue in the fall, because all you're going to do is come in and make a big old muddy mess next year when you feed hay again. So you need to kind of think about, in some form or fashion, trying to change your hay feeding strategy. It might be making a heavy use feeding pad, so that they aren't making that muddy mess, and you have a good solid place to be able to feed. You might decide that you want to start rolling some bales out. There's some things to pay attention to there, but you need to think about something to keep from making this big muddy mess every year. Otherwise, it's just going to be a constant issue that you face every February to March is mud issues. Okay. So we got anybody have any questions on this before we change gears again?
Well, we got one in the chat. It says, how do you combat pigweed if you're on a whale? Of course, Dr. Rhodes will get into more of that tomorrow, but I don't know if you want to hit on pigweed control on a whale. So I don't know what that's going to mean, Gary.
Okay, so I'm assuming that that's meaning because you do not want to have a contamination issue with something like the 2,4-D. I'm assuming, Kevin, is that the way you're taking that question?
Yes, that's the way I take it. Yes.
Okay, so usually we don't worry too much about something like 2,4-D in terms of that type of thing. If you're using the recommended rates and all, like 2 pints per acre or something like that, the ones that we worry about that are much more water soluble might be, I don't know, some things like if you're using Grazon P+D, which a lot of people don't use that anymore, but some of the other real water soluble ones. But to control like spiny pigweed, that's with 2,4-D, I don't worry too much about a well issue on that one. Okay, any other questions on that, Kevin? I'm going to let you keep track of the chat.
That's all for right now.
Okay. Okay, let's cover a little bit about grass tetany. So just as a reminder, so what grass tetany is low magnesium levels in a grazing animal, in a cow, okay? And it's usually caused by kind of a combination of two issues. One of them is if you have spring calving cows, once they calve, they're milking, so their requirement, for magnesium goes way up. Plus, when you get into the early part of the spring and you have these really fast growing forages, okay, that the plants just physically can't hardly take up enough magnesium. And so there's low magnesium in the forage, which means there's low magnesium in animals' diet, and you can get grass tetany. Really, the things that we can do to try to prevent it is, number one, this fertilizing by soil test, because what happens is if you have high potassium levels in the soil, that interferes with the animal's ability or with the plant's ability to be able to take up the magnesium. And also, it seems like there sometimes might be an interaction with high potassium and the animal's ability to be able to absorb the magnesium. And then also, it's the way to prevent it is during the springtime to feed a high mag mineral block. So usually it's 10 to 14%. I had a conversation yesterday with Dr. Katie Mason, letting her know kind of what I was going to cover. So she's going to, I think, talk a little bit more in depth about some of these issues on what is that going to be? I think Friday. But anyway, you need to be paying attention to that and making sure that this is the time of year you need to be switching to a high magnesium mineral to try to prevent grass tetany. And I hope there aren't too many questions on that, because we're delving into animal science, which is not my exact sweet spot. We're more on the forage side, but this is what grass tetany is. Pay attention to it this time of the year.
Well, Dr. Bates, Katie is on here. Dr. Katie's, I think, participating, so maybe she's listening to what you're saying and be prepared for Friday. She is on.
She can correct whatever I say that is incorrect. Okay. And then I guess one of the last things that we're going to cover before we just kind of open it up in general for questions is we need to be thinking about, the next year, for the next, all the way through the spring into the summer and everything, about what kind of things do we need to be watching for. Okay, so I listed a few of those things. The first thing is, do you have a plan for summer grazing? Okay, so I know y'all just got out of some, really intense winter weather, but now is the time to be thinking about what's going to happen during the summertime, because in reality, the next thing that's going to happen, we're going to turn around and we're going to be in the 90s and it's going to be hot. Fescue is going to be slumping. And if you want to be able to make sure that you have grazing during that time, you really need to be kind of making some plans right now. So, think about trying to look when we get into kind of that March and April period, be evaluating your pastures. Do you have some of your fescue pastures that might be just a little bit thin? And so, maybe you're going to have to do some reseeding on some of those. Well, if that's the case, you might think about trying to plant some sort of a summer annual into those. Maybe overseed those with some crabgrass, so that you can have some crabgrass during the summertime to be able to graze. If it's pretty thin, you could even drill some sorghum Sudan grass or something into it. You've got some open spots in that stand, so the summer annual will be able to get established and come on up through that. And then if it hurt some of the fescue plants, that's not the end of the world, because you're going to probably need to come in and thicken up that stand in the fall anyway. So it'll help you get some summer grazing, and it'll put you in a situation where you can do some reseeding in the fall. You also need to be, looking at, do you have some fields that maybe just need to be completely renovated? Maybe the stand is so thin, the weed pressure over the last couple of years has been so heavy that you need to be thinking about, maybe spraying and killing those and getting ready to seed in the fall with fescue. Well, if that's the case, the perfect thing you could do right there is to be able to go ahead and kill them in the spring and plant a summer annual. Could be sorghum Sudan grass, crabgrass. There's several options to be able to choose, but that's going to give you a lot of grazing during that summertime. If you do that, you can graze that during the summer, and it lets you be able to rest some of your fescue pastures, so you don't overgraze those during the summertime and then thin those stands out. So that's kind of be the thing that you need to really be thinking about. Don't wait until July to try to figure out your summer grazing plan. You need to be thinking about that in April and May, so you can make some arrangements to figure out how you're going to provide animals the forage that they need during that summertime. Because, as cold as it's been the last couple of weeks for y'all, we know it's going to be just as hot during that July and August period. Okay, and so with that, those are the points, that I wanted to try to cover. You need to be thinking about planting clovers, soil testing, thinking about what you're going to do for summer grazing, and then paying attention to the, to grass tetany and magnesium supplementation. Okay, so Kevin, do we have any questions in the chat? In fact, I tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to go ahead and stop my sharing right now. Open this chat up.
I don't think so, but we'll just open the floor. If anybody's got any questions right now, we can type them in chat, or they can ask. But there's one now. Any good reading reference for first-time landowner?
Oh man, there's a lot of them. Okay, I would tell you one of the best places to start with is just go to, the Beef and Forage Center website, utbeef.com. and it will have, excuse me, it'll have all our beef and forage, publications. It'll have our seeding guides. It'll have a discussion about different forage species, grazing management, just various things like that. That's the first place to be able to go. Another fantastic resource, is going to be your local extension agent. I mean, I hate to say that with all of them listening, man, they're fantastic resources. They know more about your local situation, than maybe I'm going to know all the way over here in Knoxville, and they can help you kind of develop the kind of a recipe in terms of getting your land into the shape it needs to be. So that's really going to be one of the first places you want to go to is your local extension office.
Gary, what about Southern Forages? That'd be a good start too, wouldn't it?
Yeah, Southern Forages is a great book. If anybody has the latest copy of that, it's a great general book to be able to look at. That it won't have, it will get you in a good shape then to be able to know kind of more about the questions to ask, and then come to utbeef.com and find the very specific things that are going to be local for Tennessee. But yeah, that's a good idea.
All right, the next question looks like we got in chat. I've considered weed control in November and clover in February. Is that an option?
Okay, yeah, so that is an option, and I'm sure Dr. Rhodes is going to talk a lot about this probably tomorrow. But one of the things that we have the chance to do when it comes time to controlling cool season weeds, buttercup, thistles, plantains, those kind of things, is we can spray in kind of that November, December period, kill those things, because those weeds are going to germinate in September or October. So we can kill them in November, December. And then if you're using 2,4-D, you got to wait about a 28 to 30 day period after spraying 2,4-D before you plant clovers. Well, you spray back in that kind of late fall, early winter. By the time it comes time to February, you plant clovers, 2,4-D is going to be gone. So yes, that works fantastic.
All right, next question says when to spread Bermuda and at what rate?
Okay, Bermuda grass is going to be something that we're going to want to plant more kind of in that, I'm going to say mid to late May, kind of early June period. So when the soil is starting to warm up some, but we still have pretty good moisture, that's when we want to plant Bermuda grass. And we're usually going to want to be somewhere in the 10 to 12 pound per acre rate. Now, some of that is going to depend on most of these Bermuda grass seeded varieties are coated. And so if you read the seed tag and it says, it's 30% inert matter, which is 30% coating, then 10 to 12 pounds will work. If it starts getting up to 50% coating, then you might want to bump it up instead of 10 to 12, bump it up kind of to 12 to 15. So it will depend on the variety and how much coating there is. When you get ready to plant Bermuda grass, the big thing you got to pay attention for is to make sure you don't get that seed too deep. It is a really small seed. So if you're going to try to drill it, you need to really be careful to make sure that you're not placing that seed too deep. If you're going to work the ground up, you want to make sure you cultipack before you broadcast that seed, so you firm that seed bed up really good, because you're just barely wanting that seed to get under the soil surface. An 1/8 of an inch is about as deep as you want with that. So mid to late May, early June, 10 to 12 pounds to the acre, 1/8 of an inch deep.
Okay, next question is what variety of crabgrass is suited for Middle Tennessee?
Well, there's actually almost every variety of crabgrass is suited for Middle Tennessee. Okay, even the cracks in the parking lots of every church and grocery store is suited for crabgrass, if you've ever noticed. There's several varieties out there. The one that everybody thinks of is called Red River. It was really kind of the first one that was available, but then there's, been new ones. There's one called Quick and Big. There's one called Quick and Big Spreader. There's a couple more that I can't think of the name off the top of my head, some that put out by Noble Foundation, but pretty much all of them are good varieties. They yield well and all. If you want to look at, varieties actually of crabgrass or a whole bunch of other forages. Again, one of the places to go is if you go to utbeef.com, look under the forage section, there's a thing that says forage variety trials. And you can go onto that page and you can see some of the different trials that we've done where we look and plant different varieties of these species, and you can see how they yield and how well they do and that kind of thing.
Okay, let's see what else we got there. Amanda's put a couple things in there, some links to the forage seeding guide, forage variety trials, forage species. I guess too, Dr. Bates, if they go just do the Google search for UT beef and forage, they'll get to that website, and then they can go in and find a lot of this stuff, the variety trial information and the publications and so forth. But that's in the chat.
Okay.
Amanda's put those in. Thanks, Amanda, for those links.
Dr. Bates?
Yeah.
Dr. Bates, I got a question here. I know in your repairing hay feeding areas and stuff, you had said, option one was there to level that area out and come with, an annual ryegrass could be a possibility, or oats, either one of those. Of course, we got a fall seeding date and a spring seeding date on those. I know Matt Webb did some demo work and stuff last year on that. What's your thoughts on fall seeding versus a spring seeding as far as the amount of yield that we could expect from a grazing situation?
Okay, so if we're taking the hay feeding issues and all that out, if it's just purely spring versus fall seeding of cool season annuals, then no, man, I want fall seeding every day of the week, because I have a much longer period of time for the plants to get established. And then when I get into the springtime, they're established, and bam, they're gonna yield a lot more. So without a doubt, for cool season annuals, I want to plant in the fall. In actuality, the reason that we don't recommend like rye and wheat for this spring seeding to repair hay feeding areas is because rye and wheat have to go through something called vernalization. They actually have to get really cold temperatures for them to be able to, produce a head and kind of give you some bulk. So if you plant them in the spring, that won't happen. If you plant them in the fall, it does. Ryegrass and oats do not need that vernalization, and so you'll get more yield off of those if you plant those in that springtime period. So I would say this: anytime I can plant in the fall, I'm going to. Okay, definitely if you're planting fescue or orchard grass, you definitely want to plant in the fall. Don't ever spring seed fescue and orchard grass. You're going to end up with about half a stand is best you're going to end up with.
Well, that's sort of where my thought process was going, because those guys, we're getting those calls that, they've had terrible feeding areas for sure, terrible feeding situation, but they also got thin pastures and stuff that they didn't take the opportunity to reseed in the fall. And so now they're thinking, hey, is there something I can put on there to bump up my grazing and stuff for this spring? So, would your thoughts be better to wait from a grazing standpoint, to wait till May and possibly try to incorporate some crabgrass or a summer annual?
Okay, so now it's a good question. And, man, I wish there were easy answers to something like that. But if I found myself in a situation where I had a thin stand of fescue, it was not going to give me the yield I wanted in the springtime, then what I would do, quite honestly, is I would drill oats into it. And I do it like as soon as I could. And that's going to give me the chance to get more spring yield off of it, because it's going to give me plants and give me some yield. But what's going to happen is I get into that May period, that oat's going to die, and I'm going to still be left with a thin stand. So I'd want to come back in the fall and drill the fescue into it. If you try to drill fescue into that situation in, February to March, what's going to happen is those plants are going to get up at, a couple of inches tall. We're going to be into, May, it's starting to get hot, and those seedlings are not going to survive. So if you're in the spring, thin stand, you need more plants, drill oats into them, and then reseed the fescue in the fall. If anybody wants to see the difference between spring and fall seeding of something like orchard grass and tall fescue, we did a demo with that down there at the Middle Tennessee Research and Education Center.
There it is. Can you see it, Gary? Can y'all see my screen?
Yeah.
That's it.
Okay, so yeah, what we ended up with, we did a video on this, and I guess this is just a kind of a screen capture on that. But when we seeded in the spring, well, when we seeded in the fall, we got perfect stands of fescue and orchard grass. Looked good, thick, the whole thing was perfect. When we seeded in the spring, we got the stands up, but then crabgrass and common Bermuda grass and everything else just ate its lunch. So we ended up with nothing but just a basically a Bermuda grass and crabgrass bed. No fescue or orchard grass left. So watch that video. I just checked on it. I had a question about that the other day, and I sent somebody that video. It's just at utbeef.com. Go under forages and look under videos, and you can watch that video. It's really a pretty eye-opening demo that we did.
Gary, that was just pictures that I went and took out there, and I can't remember the time of year, but I mean, it's obvious you could. That was a question I had in the master beef class that we've done, but you can sure see the difference in the fescue and orchard grass in picture A, and then picture B was a split it was the same application just made in the spring, and all of that stuff is just pretty much common Bermuda grass. It just pretty much killed it right there.
Okay. Any other questions?
Yeah, we had, let's see, there was a question about broadcasting crabgrass.
Okay, so crabgrass is going to be a very, very similar recommendation really to Bermuda grass. It's going to be in that, mid-May to early June period, something along those lines. That's going to when you're going to want to plant that. Let's see, I see that other one down there. Yeah, Mojo crabgrass is a blend of Red River and Impact. Okay, so I don't know a lot about Impact, that variety of crabgrass. I'll have to do some checking. I'm gonna make a note to try to hunt that up here later on. But I know the Red River, I mean, it's a good variety that has worked really well for a lot of years. Any other questions? Can we broadcast crabgrass? Yes, you can. In fact, that's probably one of the best ways to be able to plant it is just to try to broadcast it. I've tried drilling it before, and depending on the drill that you have, the one that I used was I guess it was a hay buster drill, and you have to use the clover box, the small seed box, to get it cranked down low enough to just plant 4 to 6 pounds to the acre. And where the tube came out of that clover box and it spun and it went right into kind of the big tube, the crabgrass seed was not real clean and it stuck in that tube. We had to vacuum it all out and broadcast it. So broadcasting will work perfect on crabgrass.
I think Amanda may have put the video in on there as a link as well.
Man, that Amanda's pretty handy. You know that?
She's good at that.
Okay, and I see Matt saying that Impact is a new Noble Foundation variety. Okay, so if you go to our variety trials, we've probably had that variety because I know Noble Foundation had put some varieties in there. I don't know if they actually had the name yet of Impact. It may have had one of their like experimental numbers, but I think we have had that tested in our variety trial, so you can see how well that that worked. And as a matter of fact, I'm going to take a hint from Amanda. Let me hunt that up and show where that is. Well, variety trials. Okay. Okay, so like I'm trying to find if we've those Noble Foundation varieties, see if we had those in there somewhere. No, I don't see those in there, but like I'll show you right here. Let me share my screen here. I think it's right here. So you can see here's the variety trials, and here's some. This one is from 2018. Where was it done? It was done in Greenville, Tennessee. And you can see the sorghum Sudan grasses that we had in there, but you can also see some of the crab grasses that we had in there. And you can see, I mean, we were getting, 5 to 6 tons of yield. And we've had these tests done at, various locations. I think we had one, here's one that was done in Crossville, and it did not have the noble foundations, but we're getting, 3 tons of yield. So you can go through and see a lot of different information that we have about the various variety tests that we do. Any other questions?